Maria Hernandez stood in the sterile waiting room of the military administrative building, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the manila envelope containing her life's most painful memories. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across her weathered face, highlighting the premature lines that spoke of experiences no 35-year-old woman should have endured. She had been waiting for 3 hours, but time seemed meaningless when measured against the years she had spent trying to reach this moment. The receptionist, a young corporal with kind eyes, glanced up from her computer screen. "Ma'am, Colonel Patterson will see you now. Third door on the right." Maria nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now that it was here, every word she had planned seemed to evaporate. Colonel James Patterson was exactly what Maria had expected from a career military officer. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair cut in a precise military style and steel-blue eyes that seemed to assess everything with calculated efficiency. His office walls were lined with commendations, photographs with high-ranking officials, and the kind of memorabilia that spoke of a distinguished career built on order, protocol, and unwavering discipline. "Mrs. Hernandez," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his imposing oak desk. "I understand you have some concerns regarding your late husband's service record." His voice was professional but distant, the tone of a man who had heard countless complaints and knew most would amount to nothing more than paperwork discrepancies. Maria settled into the chair, her back straight, despite the weight of exhaustion that seemed to press down on her shoulders. "Colonel, my husband Carlos served as a combat translator in Afghanistan. He died 3 years ago, and I've been trying to get recognition for what really happened during his deployment. The official reports don't tell the whole story." Colonel Patterson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he regarded her with polite skepticism. "Mrs. Hernandez, I've reviewed your husband's file extensively. Staff Sergeant Carlos Hernandez served admirably as a translator with the 82nd Airborne Division. His death was classified as a training accident during a routine exercise. While tragic, there's nothing in his record to suggest anything beyond standard deployment activities." "That's exactly the problem," Maria said, her voice gaining strength. "The official records are sanitized. They don't mention the classified missions, the times he was embedded with special operations units, or the fact that he saved dozens of American lives during an operation that officially never happened." The colonel's expression remained unchanged, but Maria caught a slight tightening around his eyes. "Mrs. Hernandez, I understand grief can sometimes lead people to seek greater meaning in tragedy, but making claims about classified operations without evidence is a serious matter. If such operations existed, which I'm not saying they did, the details would be far above both our clearance levels." Maria felt the familiar surge of frustration that had driven her through 3 years of bureaucratic dead ends. "Colonel, I'm not some grieving widow making up stories to feel better. I lived with Carlos for 12 years. I saw him before each deployment and after each return. I know the difference between standard translator duty and what he actually endured." "And what exactly do you believe he endured?" The colonel's tone had taken on a slightly condescending edge that made Maria's jaw clench. She opened her manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of photographs, documents, and personal items. Carlos documented everything he could without violating operational security. These photos show him in gear and locations that don't match any of the official deployment records. These personal letters describe missions that lasted weeks in hostile territory, not the safe forward operating base assignments listed in his service record. Colonel Patterson barely glanced at the materials before pushing them back across the desk. "Mrs. Hernandez, photographs can be misleading, and personal letters often exaggerate experiences. Soldiers sometimes embellish their activities in correspondence home, either to seem more important or to process their experiences. Without official documentation, these items prove nothing." "What about this?" Maria pulled out a small metal fragment, placing it carefully on the desk. Carlos carried this piece of shrapnel for 2 years. It came from the IED that nearly killed him during a mission to rescue captured American soldiers. A mission that doesn't exist in any official record. The colonel glanced at the metal fragment dismissively. Mrs. Hernandez, shrapnel is unfortunately common in combat zones. The fact that your husband carried a piece proves nothing about the circumstances of how he acquired it. Soldiers often keep such mementos from various experiences. Maria's composure began to crack. Colonel, my husband came home from his final deployment changed. Not just tired or stressed, but fundamentally altered. He had nightmares about events that supposedly never happened. He spoke in his sleep about people he couldn't save, missions that went wrong, friends who died beside him. You can't fake that kind of trauma. Mrs. Hernandez, the colonel said, his voice taking on a patient but firm tone. Post-traumatic stress can manifest in many ways. Sometimes the mind creates false memories or exaggerates real experiences to cope with the general stress of combat. What you describe could easily be explained by the normal pressures of deployment, even in a non-combat translator role. The dismissal in his voice ignited something fierce in Maria's chest. Normal pressures? Colonel, my husband lost 40 pounds during his final deployment. He came back speaking Pashto in his sleep and knowing tactical procedures that aren't taught to translators. He could identify weapon systems, describe enemy tactics, and navigate hostile territory like someone who had spent months in active combat operations. Again, Mrs. Hernandez, soldiers pick up all kinds of information during deployment. Proximity to combat units can expose translators to various aspects of military operations without them being directly involved in classified missions. Maria stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists. You're not listening to me. You're so convinced that what I'm telling you is impossible that you won't even consider the evidence. Carlos didn't just pick up random military knowledge. He lived it, breathed it, survived it, and ultimately died because of it. Colonel Patterson remained seated, his expression professionally neutral. Mrs. Hernandez, I understand you're upset, but making unsupported claims about classified operations is not going to help your case. If you have legitimate concerns about your husband's service record, I suggest you work through proper channels with documented evidence. Proper channels? Maria's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain control. I've spent 3 years working through proper channels. Every office sends me to another office. Every official tells me the same thing you're telling me now. No one wants to admit that Carlos was involved in operations that officially don't exist, because that would mean admitting those operations happened at all. The colonel stood as well, clearly signaling the end of the meeting. Mrs. Hernandez, I sympathize with your loss, but I cannot authorize any changes to your husband's service record based on the materials you've presented. The official documentation stands as filed. Maria gathered her papers with shaking hands, stuffing them back into the envelope. Colonel, somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, there are American soldiers alive today because my husband risked everything to save them. He deserves to be remembered for who he really was, not the sanitized version that fits neatly into official paperwork. If such operations occurred, Mrs. Hernandez, the men involved would be honored appropriately through proper channels. The fact that your husband's record shows standard translator duty suggests that's exactly what his service entailed. As Maria reached the door, she turned back one final time. Colonel Patterson, I hope you never have to experience what I've been through. But if you do, I hope someone believes you when you tell them the truth. The colonel watched as she left, already reaching for the next file on his desk. Another grieving family member unwilling to accept the simple truth of military bureaucracy. He had seen dozens like her over the years, all convinced their loved one had been involved in something greater than their official record indicated. The reality was usually much more mundane than their grief-stricken imaginations suggested. But as the afternoon wore on, Colonel Patterson found himself unable to concentrate on his other cases. Something about Maria Hernandez's passionate certainty had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite define. He had dealt with delusional family members before, but there had been something different in her eyes. Not the desperate fantasy of someone creating meaning from tragedy, but the frustrated determination of someone who knew the truth and couldn't make anyone else see it. He found himself pulling Carlos Hernandez's file again, reading through the sparse details of a deployment that seemed almost too routine for someone who had supposedly experienced such trauma. The psychological evaluation noted some signs of combat stress, but nothing that would indicate the kind of intensive special operations exposure Maria had described. Still, there was something about the file that bothered him. It was too clean, too simple for a deployment that had lasted 15 months in one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. Most translator files contained more detail, more incident reports, more evidence of the daily challenges of working with combat units in hostile territory. As evening approached and the building emptied of personnel, Colonel Patterson made a decision that surprised him. He accessed the classified database and ran a search for any references to Staff Sergeant Carlos Hernandez outside of his official service record. What he found made him pause. There were gaps in the digital trail, periods where Hernandez's location wasn't logged in the standard systems, times when he seemed to disappear from the normal administrative tracking that followed every soldier's daily activities. These gaps coincided exactly with the time frames Maria had mentioned for the classified missions she believed her husband had participated in. Colonel Patterson leaned back in his chair, staring at the computer screen. Gaps in the system weren't necessarily meaningful. Technical glitches, communication failures, and administrative oversights happened regularly in combat zones. But the pattern of these particular gaps seemed too consistent, too precisely timed to be coincidental. He thought about Maria's desperate certainty, her detailed knowledge of military procedures, and her husband's documented symptoms of severe combat trauma. While none of it constituted proof of anything beyond standard deployment stress, it created a picture that was beginning to feel more complex than the official record suggested. For the first time in his career, Colonel Patterson found himself wondering if there might be truth hidden beneath the surface of an official military record. The thought disturbed him more than he cared to admit, because if Maria Hernandez was right, it meant the system he had devoted his life to serving was capable of erasing people's sacrifices for the sake of operational security. As he locked the classified files and prepared to leave his office, Colonel Patterson made another decision. Tomorrow, he would make some discreet inquiries among his contacts who had served in Afghanistan during the relevant time frame. If Carlos Hernandez had really been involved in classified operations, someone would remember him. And if Maria was telling the truth, she deserved more than the dismissive reception he had given her today. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and despite his instincts toward skepticism and protocol, Colonel Patterson found himself hoping that Maria Hernandez would return. Because if she was right about her husband's service, then she deserved justice. And if she was wrong, she deserved compassion and closure, not the bureaucratic stonewalling she had received. Either way, the woman who had sat across from his desk today deserved more than he had given her. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of finding out which version of the truth would prove to be real. Colonel Patterson arrived at his office the next morning with an unusual sense of purpose. The previous evening's discovery of the gaps in Carlos Hernandez's digital trail had kept him awake longer than he cared to admit. Over his morning coffee, he had made a list of contacts who might have information about special operations in Afghanistan during the relevant time frame. His first call was to Lieutenant Colonel Mike Stevens, an old friend who had commanded special operations units throughout multiple deployments in Afghanistan. Stevens now worked at the Pentagon, coordinating between various classified programs and conventional military operations. "Mike, I need to ask you about something sensitive," Patterson said after the usual pleasantries. "Do you remember a Staff Sergeant Carlos Hernandez? Translator 82nd Airborne, deployed 2019 to 2021? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Stevens finally spoke, his voice had changed noticeably. "Jim, why are you asking about Hernandez?" The shift in tone immediately caught Patterson's attention. "His widow came to see me yesterday. She's claiming he was involved in classified operations that don't appear in his official record. I thought it was the usual family fantasy until I started looking deeper." "Jim, this isn't a conversation we should have over an unsecured line. But let me ask you something. Why is his widow coming to you now?" "It's been years since his death." Patterson explained Maria's 3-year struggle through military bureaucracy, her claims about her husband's documented trauma, and the materials she had presented as evidence. As he spoke, he could hear Stevens typing in the background. "Jim, I'm sending you a secure message. Check your classified email in 10 minutes. And Jim, be very careful how you handle this situation. Some stories are buried for good reasons." The line went dead, leaving Patterson staring at his phone with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He had expected either confirmation that Maria was delusional or a simple explanation for her husband's trauma. Stevens's response suggested the situation was far more complicated than either scenario. Exactly 10 minutes later, Patterson's classified email chimed. Stevens's message was brief but pointed. "Carlos Hernandez was attached to Operation Silent Thunder from March 2020 to January 2021. Check with Colonel Martinez, who ran linguistic support for special operations. Official records were sanitized per standard protocol. Tread carefully." Operation Silent Thunder wasn't a name Patterson recognized, which immediately told him it was a highly classified program. The fact that official records had been sanitized per standard protocol suggested Maria might have been telling the truth about her husband's involvement in operations that officially didn't exist. Colonel Elena Martinez was based at Fort Bragg, where she oversaw language specialists for various special operations units. Patterson had worked with her briefly years earlier and remembered her as a straight-talking professional who didn't tolerate bureaucratic games. "Elena, I need information about a translator who may have worked with your units. Carlos Hernandez, KIA 3 years ago." "Patterson, right? I remember you from the Syria briefings." Martinez's voice was carefully neutral. "What's your interest in Hernandez?" "His widow is seeking recognition for his service. She claims he was involved in classified operations, but his official record shows only standard translator duty." Martinez was quiet for almost a minute. When she spoke, her voice had taken on a tone of measured caution. "Hernandez was one of our best, embedded with special operations teams for extended missions in extremely hostile territory. He saved a lot of lives during his time with us." Patterson felt something cold settle in his stomach. "His official record shows he was assigned to forward operating base duty, translating for routine patrols and meetings." "Official records show what they need to show," Martinez replied carefully. "But Jim, Hernandez was the real deal. He went places and did things that most career Special Forces operators would find challenging. His language skills were exceptional, but more than that, he had the tactical instincts and courage for deep insertion operations." "What kind of operations?" "The kind that officially don't exist. Hostage rescue, intelligence gathering behind enemy lines, coordinating with local resistance networks. Hernandez spent months operating in areas where capture meant torture and execution. He volunteered for missions that other translators wouldn't touch." Patterson pulled up Carlos's official service record on his computer screen, comparing it to what Martinez was telling him. "Elena, if this is true, why was his record sanitized so completely? Usually there's at least some indication of special assignment." "Because Silent Thunder wasn't just classified, it was compartmentalized beyond normal special access programs. The operations were so sensitive that even the existence of the program couldn't be acknowledged. Everyone involved understood that their official records would reflect conventional assignments. Did Hernandez understand that when he volunteered? He understood better than most. Jim Carlos Hernandez could have stayed safe on the FAB, doing routine translation work and going home with a clean record and full benefits. Instead, he chose to put his life on the line repeatedly for operations that he knew would never be officially recognized. That takes a special kind of courage. Patterson thought about Maria's passionate advocacy for her husband's memory, her frustration at having his sacrifice minimized and dismissed. Martinez, his widow has been fighting for 3 years to get recognition for what he really did. She's been told by everyone, including me, that she's imagining things. She's not imagining anything. Carlos came back from his final deployment severely traumatized by what he'd experienced. The psychological evaluation noted signs of extreme combat stress, but it couldn't detail the actual causes without compromising operational security. What happened during his final deployment? Martinez paused again, and Patterson could hear the weight of difficult memories in her silence. Jim, there was a mission in October 2021, just before his rotation was supposed to end. A team of American contractors had been captured in a remote valley near the Pakistan border. The official rescue mission was deemed too risky, but Hernandez volunteered to go in with a 4-man special operations team. What happened? They found the contractors, but the compound was heavily defended. During the extraction, an IED took out their transport vehicle. Hernandez stayed behind to provide covering fire while the team evacuated the wounded contractors. He took shrapnel from a second explosion but kept fighting until everyone was clear. Patterson thought about the piece of shrapnel Maria had shown him, the metal fragment her husband had carried as a memento. Was he wounded in this operation? Hernandez had metal fragments embedded throughout his back and left arm. The medical team wanted to evacuate him for surgery, but he refused to leave until the mission was complete. He operated for 3 more days with untreated shrapnel wounds, guiding the team through hostile territory to the extraction point. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that made Patterson feel sick with guilt over his dismissive treatment of Maria. Elena? The official report on his death lists it as a training accident. Carlos died during a routine training exercise 6 months after returning from deployment. But Jim, the man who died in that training accident, wasn't the same person who had volunteered for Silent Thunder. The trauma from his final mission had changed him fundamentally. In what way? He couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate, couldn't function normally. The official psychological evaluations couldn't document the real causes of his trauma without revealing classified operations. He was getting treatment, but it was limited by what the therapists were allowed to know about his actual experiences. Patterson leaned back in his chair, processing the implications of what Martinez was telling him. So when his widow says the official records don't tell the whole story, she's absolutely right. More than right. Carlos Hernandez is a hero who saved dozens of American lives during operations that officially never happened. His widow has every right to be proud of what he accomplished and angry about how his sacrifice has been minimized. After ending the call with Martinez, Patterson sat alone in his office, staring at the sanitized service record that had formed the basis of his dismissive treatment of Maria Hernandez. Everything she had told him was true. Her husband had been involved in classified operations, had suffered severe trauma from experiences that couldn't be officially acknowledged, and had died still carrying the psychological wounds from missions that existed only in the memories of those who had been there. Patterson thought about Maria's photographs, which he had barely glanced at before dismissing as meaningless. Her husband's personal letters, which he had assumed were exaggerated soldier stories. The piece of shrapnel, which he had treated as random military memorabilia. All of it had been evidence of the truth she was desperately trying to get someone to acknowledge. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Major David Chen, a special operations veteran who now worked as a counselor for veterans dealing with trauma from classified missions. Chen specialized in cases where official records couldn't reflect the real nature of a soldier's service. Dave, I need your expertise on a case involving a translator who was attached to special operations units in Afghanistan. The official record has been sanitized, but I'm getting indications he was involved in extremely high-risk missions. Chen listened as Patterson described Carlos Hernandez's case and Maria's 3-year struggle for recognition. When Patterson finished, Chen's response was immediate and emotional. "Jim, I know exactly who you're talking about. Carlos Hernandez was legendary among the special operations community. The man saved more lives than most career special forces operators. His death was a tragedy that affected everyone who had served with him." Dave, why would his record be sanitized so completely? Usually, there's at least some indication of special assignment, even for classified operations. Because Silent Thunder was different. It involved operations so sensitive that acknowledging them could have compromised ongoing intelligence assets and endangered lives. Everyone who participated understood that their service would never be officially recognized. But that means families like Maria Hernandez are left with no way to understand or honor what their loved ones actually sacrificed. Exactly. It's one of the worst aspects of these compartmentalized programs. The families suffer twice, once from the loss itself, and again from having that loss minimized by official records that don't reflect reality. Patterson thought about his own distinguished career, built on official recognition for conventional military service. The idea that soldiers like Carlos Hernandez could sacrifice so much with no possibility of official acknowledgement seemed fundamentally unjust. Dave, what happens when families like Maria try to get recognition through official channels? What happened to her? They get bounced from office to office, told they're imagining things, treated like delusional grievers who can't accept simple explanations. It's systematic gaslighting, and it's one of the reasons I left active duty to work with these families. Is there anything that can be done for her? Officially, nothing. The operational security requirements that justified sanitizing her husband's record haven't changed. But personally, you can acknowledge the truth of what she's telling you. You can treat her with the respect she deserves as the widow of a genuine hero. After ending the call, Patterson spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing everything Maria had presented to him, this time with the understanding that it all represented evidence of the truth rather than the fantasies of a grieving widow. The photographs showed Carlos in gear and locations consistent with special operations missions. His personal letters described experiences that aligned perfectly with what Martinez and Chen had told him about Silent Thunder operations. Most importantly, the piece of shrapnel Maria had shown him wasn't random military memorabilia. It was a fragment from the IED explosion that had nearly killed her husband during his final heroic mission, a piece of metal that represented everything he had sacrificed for operations that officially never existed. As evening approached, Colonel Patterson made a decision that would have surprised him just 2 days earlier. He was going to call Maria Hernandez and ask her to come back. Not to dismiss her claims or send her through more bureaucratic channels, but to acknowledge the truth of what she had been trying to tell him. He couldn't change her husband's official record or provide the formal recognition she sought, but he could give her something almost as valuable. Validation from someone in authority that her husband's sacrifice was real, important, and worthy of honor. After 3 years of being told she was imagining things, Maria deserved to hear from someone who understood that she had been telling the truth all along. The phone rang twice before Maria answered, her voice cautious and tired. "Mrs. Hernandez, this is Colonel Patterson. I was wondering if you might be willing to come back and speak with me again. I've learned some things that change my understanding of your husband's service." There was a long pause before Maria responded. "Colonel, I don't think I can handle another meeting where you tell me I'm imagining things." "Mrs. Hernandez, I owe you an apology. Your husband was a hero, and I should have taken your claims seriously from the beginning. Would you be willing to give me another chance to listen to what you have to say?" For the first time in 3 years, Maria Hernandez heard something in an official's voice that she had been waiting for: respect, acknowledgement, and the possibility that someone finally believed her. Maria Hernandez sat in the same chair she had occupied 3 days earlier, but everything about this meeting felt different. Colonel Patterson's demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the polite skepticism and bureaucratic distance. In its place was a solemnity and respect that she had been hoping to encounter for 3 years, but had begun to think impossible. "Mrs. Hernandez," Colonel Patterson began, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there during their first meeting. "I owe you a profound apology. I spent yesterday and today speaking with people who served with your husband. What I learned has fundamentally changed my understanding of his service and your struggle for recognition." Maria felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. After years of dismissal and bureaucratic stonewalling, hearing those words from a senior military officer was almost overwhelming. "Colonel, what exactly did you learn?" "I learned that Carlos was attached to Operation Silent Thunder, one of the most classified special operations programs in Afghanistan. I learned that he volunteered for missions that career Special Forces operators considered extremely dangerous. Most importantly, I learned that everything you told me during our first meeting was true." Maria's hands began to shake slightly as 3 years of suppressed frustration and grief threatened to surface. "Colonel, do you understand what it's been like? Having everyone treat me like I was making up stories about my own husband? Being told that I was imagining his trauma, his nightmares, his sacrifice? I'm beginning to understand, and I'm deeply sorry for how you've been treated, including by me." Patterson leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Mrs. Hernandez, your husband was involved in operations so classified that his official record had to be sanitized to protect ongoing intelligence assets. The gaps I found in his digital trail weren't administrative errors. They were deliberate omissions to hide his participation in missions that officially never happened." "What kind of missions?" Maria asked, though part of her had always known the answer would be more dangerous than anything reflected in Carlos's official service record. "Deep insertion intelligence gathering, coordination with local resistance networks, and high-risk hostage rescue operations. According to Colonel Martinez, who oversaw linguistic support for special operations, Carlos voluntarily embedded with Special Forces teams for extended missions in extremely hostile territory." Maria pulled the manila envelope from her purse and extracted the photographs she had shown during their first meeting. "Colonel, these pictures show Carlos in locations that don't match his official deployment record. I always knew they proved something, but no one would listen." Patterson examined the photographs with new understanding, seeing what he had refused to acknowledge before. Carlos was wearing specialized equipment that wouldn't have been issued to conventional translators, standing in terrain that suggested deep mountain operations far from any established base, surrounded by individuals who were clearly special operations personnel rather than regular army units. "Mrs. Hernandez, these photographs document exactly what Colonel Martinez described. Your husband was operating in areas where capture meant almost certain death, working with teams that were conducting some of the most dangerous missions of the entire war." "What about his final deployment?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something happened that last time that broke him. He came home different, traumatized in ways that the base psychologists couldn't understand or treat." Patterson had dreaded this part of the conversation, knowing that the truth would be both validating and heartbreaking for Maria. In October 2021, just weeks before Carlos was scheduled to return home, a team of American contractors was captured in a remote valley near the Pakistan border. The official rescue mission was deemed too dangerous, but Carlos volunteered to accompany a 4-man special operations team. They found the contractors. They did, but the compound was heavily defended, and during the extraction, an IED destroyed their transport vehicle. According to the mission report, Carlos stayed behind to provide covering fire while the team evacuated the wounded contractors. Maria's breath caught as she processed what Patterson was telling her. The shrapnel. Carlos carried a piece of metal from that operation. He said it reminded him of why he did what he did, but he could never tell me the details. Mrs. Hernandez, your husband was wounded by a second explosion during that mission. He had metal fragments embedded throughout his back and left arm, but he refused medical evacuation until the mission was complete. He operated for 3 more days with untreated wounds, guiding the team through hostile territory to safety. No one ever told me that, Maria said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The medical records just showed that he had been treated for minor injuries during deployment. I knew there had to be more to it. Patterson realized he was about to cross a line that he had never crossed before in his military career, but Maria deserved to know the full extent of her husband's sacrifice. Mrs. Hernandez, would you be willing to show me the scars Carlos carried from that mission? I think it would help me understand the true cost of his service. Maria hesitated for a moment, then stood and turned away from Patterson. She lifted the back of her blouse, revealing her upper back and shoulders. Colonel, these aren't my scars. I'm showing you this because Carlos showed me exactly where each piece of shrapnel had hit him, where each fragment had been removed, where the doctors had done what they could to repair the damage. Patterson stared at Maria's unmarked skin for several seconds before understanding flooded through him. Mrs. Hernandez, I don't understand what you're showing me. Maria turned around, her eyes bright with tears, but also with a determination that Patterson was beginning to recognize as the defining characteristic of her 3-year fight. Colonel, Carlos never showed anyone his scars. He was too ashamed of them, too traumatized by what they represented. But he described them to me in detail during the worst of his nightmares, when the memories would overwhelm him. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital tablet, opening a photo gallery that Patterson realized contained hundreds of pictures. Colonel, I documented everything Carlos told me about his experiences, every detail he shared during his worst moments, every nightmare that revealed pieces of what he had endured. The photographs on the tablet showed detailed diagrams that Maria had created, mapping the locations and sizes of Carlos's shrapnel wounds based on his own descriptions during trauma episodes. There were images of the metal fragment he had carried, photographs of gear he had described using, maps of terrain he had detailed in his sleep-talking episodes. Mrs. Hernandez, this is extraordinary documentation, but I still don't understand about the scars. Maria scrolled through the tablet until she found the image she was looking for. It was a photograph of Carlos taken during his final leave, shirtless and relaxed by their backyard pool. Even in the casual snapshot, the evidence of his trauma was unmistakable. His back and left arm were covered with dozens of small, circular scars where shrapnel had been removed, along with several larger surgical scars where deeper fragments had required more extensive procedures. Colonel, these are Carlos's scars. He tried so hard to hide them from me from everyone because he couldn't talk about how he got them without violating operational security. But they tell the whole story of what he sacrificed. Patterson studied the photograph, seeing evidence of trauma that went far beyond anything that could be sustained during routine translator duty. The pattern and extent of the scarring suggested someone who had been very close to a significant explosion and had been fortunate to survive with his life. Mrs. Hernandez, why didn't you show me this photograph during our first meeting? Because I was saving it for someone who actually wanted to listen to the truth, instead of just dismissing me. Colonel, Carlos made me promise never to show these pictures to anyone unless it was absolutely necessary to prove what he had done. He was so proud of his service, but he was also terrified that revealing details would compromise ongoing operations or endanger people who were still deployed. Patterson found himself studying not just the physical evidence of Carlos's wounds, but the expression on his face in the photograph. Even during a relaxed moment at home, There was a guardedness in his eyes that spoke of experiences that had fundamentally changed him. "Mrs. Hernandez, I need to ask you something difficult. Do you believe these injuries contributed to your husband's death?" "Colonel, Carlos died during a training exercise when equipment failed, but he died because he was still carrying the psychological wounds from missions that officially never happened. The base psychologists couldn't treat trauma they weren't allowed to know about. Carlos was struggling with flashbacks, nightmares, and survivor's guilt that he couldn't process because he couldn't talk about the experiences that caused them. The official investigation into his death concluded it was an accident caused by equipment failure." Maria's voice took on a bitter edge. "Colonel, my husband's psychological state isn't mentioned anywhere in the accident investigation because acknowledging it would have raised questions about what had traumatized him. It was easier to blame faulty equipment than to admit that a decorated translator was suffering from untreated combat trauma related to classified operations." Patterson realized he was looking at a man who had been failed by the very system that had sent him on dangerous missions. Carlos had volunteered for operations that required extraordinary courage, had been wounded in service to his country, and had then been denied the support he needed because providing that support would have compromised operational security. "Mrs. Hernandez, what do you want from the military? What would constitute justice for your husband's service?" "Colonel, I want Carlos to be remembered for who he really was, not the sanitized version that fits into official paperwork. I want people to know that he saved lives, that he volunteered for the most dangerous missions, that he came home carrying scars from explosions that officially never happened." "You understand that I can't change his official service record. The operational security requirements that justified sanitizing it haven't changed." "I understand that. But, Colonel, you can acknowledge the truth of what I've been telling people for 3 years. You can stop treating families like me as delusional grievers who can't accept reality. Most importantly, you can make sure that when other families come forward with similar stories, they're treated with respect instead of dismissal." Patterson thought about his own career, built on official recognition for conventional military service. The idea that soldiers like Carlos could sacrifice so much with no possibility of acknowledgement seemed fundamentally contrary to everything the military claimed to represent. "Mrs. Hernandez, I can't provide official recognition, but I can do something else. I can make sure that the people who matter in the special operations community know about your fight to honor your husband's memory. I can ensure that his sacrifice is remembered by the people who understand its significance. That would mean everything to me, Colonel. Carlos didn't do what he did for glory or recognition. He did it because it was right, because American lives were at stake. But he deserves to be remembered as the hero he was." Colonel Patterson stood and walked around his desk, extending his hand to Maria. "Mrs. Hernandez, on behalf of the United States military, I want to thank you for your husband's extraordinary service and sacrifice. Carlos Hernandez was a hero who saved American lives during operations that required exceptional courage. His country owes him a debt that can never be fully repaid." As Maria shook his hand, Patterson could see 3 years of frustration and grief beginning to transform into something approaching peace. She had finally found someone in authority who understood and acknowledged the truth of what her husband had sacrificed. "Colonel, there's something else I want you to know. Carlos kept a journal during his final deployment. He wrote about the missions, the people he served with, the contractors he helped rescue. I've never shown it to anyone because he made me promise to protect it. But I think you should see it." She pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from her envelope and placed it on Patterson's desk. "These are his own words about what he experienced. Read them, and you'll understand why I've spent 3 years fighting for recognition." Patterson opened the journal to a random page and read Carlos's account of a mission to extract an intelligence asset from behind enemy lines. The writing was precise, factual, and utterly devoid of bravado or self-aggrandizement. It read like the work of someone documenting experiences for historical accuracy rather than personal glorification. Mrs. Hernandez, this is an extraordinary document. It provides details about operations that aren't recorded anywhere else. Carlos wanted there to be some record of what happened, even if it could never be officially acknowledged. He felt responsible for making sure the truth survived, even if it had to remain hidden for decades. As their meeting concluded, Colonel Patterson realized that Maria Hernandez had given him far more than evidence of her husband's service. She had shown him the true cost of operations that existed in the shadows of official military history and the families who carried the burden of secrets that could never be acknowledged. Mrs. Hernandez, I want you to know that your husband's sacrifice will be remembered by people who matter. And I want you to know that your fight to honor his memory has changed how I understand the relationship between official records and the truth of military service. As Maria prepared to leave, she turned back one final time. Colonel, Carlos used to say that the hardest part of what he did wasn't the danger or the fear. It was knowing that if he didn't make it home, no one would ever know what he had really done. Thank you for making sure that's not true anymore. After Maria left, Colonel Patterson sat alone in his office, staring at Carlos's journal and the photographs that documented a sacrifice that officially never happened. For the first time in his career, he fully understood the difference between military records and military truth, and the families who carried the weight of that distinction. He made one final phone call that day to a contact at the Special Operations Memorial Foundation. I want to tell you about a translator named Carlos Hernandez who died 3 years ago. His name will never appear on any official memorial, but his sacrifice deserves to be remembered by people who understand what it means. The truth had finally been acknowledged, the scars had finally been seen, and a hero's sacrifice had finally been honored by someone with the authority to understand its significance.